This is the part where I'm tempted to just start out eloquently and say, when in the course of human events. It's an amazing document, and there's been a lot of things said about the Declaration of Independence. Sadly, a lot of it is very pedestrian and very basic and sometimes a bit misleading. And so I'm going to bring a couple of things up in my own humble opinion. While we're on the 250th. I ran my wallpaper of degrees, so you know I do have training in history and therefore can be held to a higher standard than someone who's just bloviating with their own opinions with no anchoring in anything. But let's take a look. This is sponsored by the Loudon Committee of VA 250. If you'd like to follow our other events, please feel welcome to go to www.loudonva250.org, and you can keep up with all the other cool things that we're doing. The 250th does not end with July 4th of 2026. We'll be in this through the Battle of Yorktown and beyond. So it's one of those great stories. Proudly part of the VA 250 committee. They've got a fine web page as well. All right? Of course, I am not an AI image. This is not an AI voice, and the research was not done using AI. Now, if I didn't use AI, what did I use? Well, we're here at the Lovettsville Library. I used some good books, and I recommend highly Joseph Ellis's Revolutionary Summer, The Birth of American Independence. He'd won the Pulitzer Prize at least once before, and I commend this nice pace to this book. It goes well. And of course, for the British side of the story, Lord Roberts' book, The Last King of America, which, thanks to Queen Elizabeth II, God rest her soul, she granted historians access to the Royal Archives at Windsor Castle. And so Lord Roberts had access to the King's diaries, his letters back and forth from Lord North and the other officials, so that we actually can say, my God, he really was implicated in all this stuff. And the book that I've most enjoyed in the last couple of weeks was Professor Meyer's book, American Scripture, The Making of the Declaration of Independence. Professor Meyer, God rest her soul, passed away in 2013 of lung cancer, but for many years she was an endowed chair professor of history at MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And I think by teaching engineers and scientists and mathematicians, her audience insisted upon logic. And I think that really comes through very nicely in her book. Very, very solid. All right, now where are we going to go with this session? First of all, one has to start with the idea that the words of the Declaration are sacred. But they didn't spring up in isolation. It wasn't just a question of a handful of guys coming up with an idea and scribbling it down and singing songs and writing that up. All right? They were part of a sequence of thought. Is that a good phrase? All right. And we're going to talk about that sequence today. Second of all, Thomas Jefferson's central to the story. He's not the only person in the story. And we'll talk about his role. Professor Meyer refers him as our country's greatest draftsman, putting together all of these other pieces that had been written by other colonists and others around the world, and bringing those together in the rough draft that then was revised by the Committee of Five, and then two days' worth of work by the Continental Congress, editing out 1/4 of Thomas Jefferson's words, coming up with the final version that we know of at the Declaration of Independence. So Jefferson's central, not the whole story. We also will try to keep an eye on the British view, their actions. The road to independence wouldn't have been necessary if it hadn't been for particular actions and reactions by the British government, the British Crown, and the British military. So the last thing is the military setting of the Declaration of Independence was dire. This was not done by comfortable people. It was people who were facing the end of the entire revolutionary enterprise due to impending attacks in New York City and an army in retreat from Canada and on its way to destroy us. So it's a very interesting topic, and we've only got 3 more minutes. Now, you know what I mean? You could spend a semester, and we, of course, won't. So if I seem to be moving faster and leaving out a detail that you know about, I'm sorry about that. We can talk about those contributions later on in our question and answer period. But this is a total view as best as I can manage. All right, let's start that sequence of thought. John Dickinson. We're going to hear about John Dickinson several times in our story. So here he is in 1768, before 1776. See, well, we've got a serious countdown beginning here. And his letters from a Pennsylvania farmer are from the days when the beginnings of what we know of as the American Revolution were a protest movement. They didn't immediately jump to let's declare war, let's declare independence. This is a very, very slow-moving volcano, and it didn't necessarily have to turn out the way it did. And so you'll notice I don't expect you to read all of this, but my YouTube audience can stop and pause if they like and read at their leisure. But he is talking about we cannot be happy without being free. We cannot be free without being secure in our property. And taxes imposed on us by Parliament take away our property. Therefore, see what I mean? That's like in geometry, a squared plus b squared. You know, that's the logical argument that Dickinson is making. All right. That's a picture of Dickinson in Newcastle, Delaware, and let's just say a few words about Dickinson while we can. He's from a Quaker family. He spent 3 years studying law in London at Middle Temple, so he got a fine education. He was there from 1753 to 1756. He was part of the Stamp Act Congress. You see how this is coming out of that first protest movement. And in 1767, he was against the Townshend Revenue Acts when we were saying no taxation without representation. He was in the First and Second Continental Congress. But interestingly enough, as we'll see, he went home, not having voted for the Declaration of Independence, and joined up in the Delaware militia, fought for our new baby country, but he's not a signer. He's not a signer of the Declaration. So let's watch his trajectory. Later on, let's see, in 1770, he married Mary Norris, who was the daughter of the Speaker of the Pennsylvania legislature. So she was a brilliant lady. His wife, Mary Norris Dickinson, had such a great personal library that became the basis for what we call Dickinson College. Dickinson College is named after John and Mary Norris Dickinson. So arguably the oldest college in the United States. There had been Harvard and others, but all right. So we end up with that. Well, the other thing about John Dickinson is he began to emancipate his enslaved workers during his lifetime. We have other men who were signers who emancipated people in their will, as George Washington did, but he actually did it during his own lifetime, the only founder to do so. Later on, he became the president of the Annapolis Convention that paved the way for the Constitutional Convention, and he signed the draft of the Constitution for the state of Delaware. What's curious about Dickinson is as the revolutionary governments were set up by the colonies in their transition to statehood as little baby countries, He was the president of Delaware from 1781 to 1783, and he was president of Pennsylvania from 1782 to 1785. He had property on both sides of the border, and they had presidents of the various states, what we would call governors. So in 1777, his house burned down in Germantown during the battle, and the portrait is by Charles Wilson Peale in 1780. Right, then Lord Hillsborough, let's get a British response. After the colonies start talking about, we won't do business with we're going to protest by not buying anything from British industry, Lord Hillsborough, the Secretary for Colonial Affairs in the British government, told the royal governors, if any assembly in your colony does this business, subscribes to this non-importation agreement, what he calls this seditious paper, he said, dissolve the colonial assembly. Just shut them down. Would that be a violation of their colonial charters? Darn right. So we've got Hillsborough doing this, and the colonists go, whoa, another brick in the wall leading to things. Now, the next guy who comes into our story is very, very dear to us here in Virginia, and very dear to us in the northern part of the Commonwealth, and that's George Mason. Let me get a good bit on him. He's got an interesting career. Unlike Dickinson, who held public office perennially, George Mason lived at Gunston Hall out on Mason's Neck, not too far from here. It's a nice little day trip for those of us in the area. But his dad drowned when he was 9. I'm starting to notice there's a surprising number of founders who lost their dads early in life and had to pick themselves up and get on with things. Henry Knox, in our last one of our previous talks. But he does that. He's the deep thinker in the crowd. He's the deep thinker. He's responsible, we're going to see, for the Fairfax Resolves and the Virginia Declaration of Rights. He's a low-key guy. Don't expect him to be addressing conventions or hosting rallies. But he does a lot of his work in the Virginia House of Burgesses, 1759 to 61, and then he was in what was called the Virginia House of Delegates, 1776 to 81, and later on 1786 to 1788. He was at the Constitutional Convention, but he opposed it. And the reason why was because the original U.S. Constitution that was proposed to the states after 1787 was missing something that we love a great deal, the Bill of Rights. So Mason was one of the guys that said, I know you're promising me that we're going to respect these rights. Put it in writing. And he's the man that we generally consider to be the advocate. Guys, let's do that. And of course they did. He married Anne Elbeck in 1750. She died in 1773. The family had 9 children. He remarried in 1780 to Sarah Brent. He's an early founder of Alexandria, and he was a local judge and vestryman of Truro Parish. He was a militia colonel before the war. Really great guy. And why are we introducing him? Is because on July 18th of 1774, at a meeting in Alexandria, we don't think of Alexandria as part of Fairfax County, but in the day, we had big counties, and then they were gradually parceled off to Arlington and all those other things that we live in. My apologies, YouTube people, we're just talking a little local here. But at that meeting, George Mason was the author. He points out, the thing is that what the Brits are doing is not only diametrically contrary to the first principles of the Constitution, the British Constitution, Magna Carta, the English Declaration of Rights. The English Constitution is a shoebox full of various step-by-step documents and traditions, unlike ours where you just go to 17 pages or whatever and you've got the whole critter right there. But he says it's not only contrary to that tradition, but it's contrary to the original compacts, those charters, which we are dependent upon the British, that have already been approved by the British Crown and Parliament. So the argument that Mason is making is that it's wrong what the Brits are doing because it violates our charters from the 1600s that say we have a right to trial by jury, we can have town meetings, we can have our colonial assemblies, whatever those different, and there's a variety of colonial governments with various kinds of charters. Then he does something which is great. He draws in 1774, the Enlightenment principles. So he goes to the contract of those charters and says, that's wrong. We're not impressed with that. But he also brings in the natural rights of mankind. So we get that other current running through the 1700s, the Age of Enlightenment. And the Continental Congress, after Lexington and Concord, and what would be called the Battle of Bunker Hill, they want to explain, well, what the heck's going on here? What are the causes and necessity for taking up arms? And guess who? John Dickinson. We just talked about him. And somebody named Thomas Jefferson, who's getting more and more into the progress and having more and more documents in his top drawer that he can call upon in July of 1776. And what do they remind us, the Continental Congress remind us of? We're angry because they're altering fundamentally the form of government established by charter. So you get that echo going through these various documents. Now, where's George III fit into all this? He's relatively, he got the throne as a young man in 1760 after his grandfather died. His dad, the Prince of Wales, had passed away unexpectedly. Married a German princess from a small principality, Mecklenburg-Strelitz. Queen Charlotte was a clever lady in her own part. When you think of her, George figured out that she needed a good house in the city, so he bought Buckingham House. They nicknamed it the Queen's House, but Charlotte liked Kew Palace, K-E-W, and she was a botanist and an expert in plants, and that's why if you go to London, go to Kew Palace and go to the gardens, because it's the sort of the national arboretum of the Hanover dynasty. They obviously didn't get along with each other. They only had 15 children. Queen Victoria was his granddaughter. The one thing that you learn from Lord Roberts' book is George wished to be what he called a patriot king and work through Parliament. Remember, if you go back to 1688, 1689, what they crazy call the Glorious Revolution, Parliament has asserted itself, and the Hanover dynasty is brought in. George I was, 52nd in line for the throne, but he was the first Protestant in the line, and so they went all the way through all those other Stuart descendants to get to the Hanover dynasty. So when George needs something to say, he's going to say, I'm with Parliament. You see how this is going to make the Revolutionary War difficult? Once Parliament goes down a particular path, can he be the driving instructor with his own steering wheel and brake pedal? Not so much. It was an era before true prime ministers, so he did have his first minister, his chancellor of the exchequer, the First Lord of the Admiralty, but it wasn't a cabinet in the sense of Tony Blair or John Cameron. I guess they're getting ready for a new one now. But he was an adult. He had a lot of interest in sciences, and he was very devoted to the Church of England, to the point of, as a Roman Catholic, being anti-Catholic. He wouldn't give the Irish a legal position if they were Catholics. But this is George's coronation portrait. So after the Battle of Bunker Hill, when 42% of the men who went up that hill were British casualties out of the 2,500 soldiers engaged, George was horrified. He was also angry that the colonists had grabbed Fort Ticonderoga when Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold did that. And so when Congress sent the Olive Branch petition that was approved on July 8, 1775, authored by John Dickinson, you see is there a theme to Bill's talk here? They sent over the Olive Branch petition. They said, look, let's get a former royal governor to deliver this to Lord Dartmouth, the then Secretary for the Colonies. And so in mid-August, former Governor Richard Penn and Arthur Lee, Richard Henry Lee's brother, we'll hear about him in the diplomatic story of the Revolution. They sent a copy to Lord Dartmouth as soon as they got off the ship, and on September 1st of 1775, they delivered to Lord Dartmouth this so-called Olive Branch petition. George III refused to accept it. He was not interested in recognizing the Continental Congress as a voice, because as far as he was concerned, this was an extra-legal operation, if not an illegal operation. And so Bunker Hill had a profound impact. According to Rick Atkinson's book, The British Are Coming, the first volume of his trilogy, 1/8 of the British officers killed in the American Revolution were gunned down at the Battle of Bunker Hill. So George would have known some of those young men. They would have been the children and godchildren of his friends. It really, really came home. George III is an angry man after the Battle of Bunker Hill. So August 23rd of 1775, he proclaims that the colonies are in a state of rebellion, and orders our officers, civil and military, to exert their utmost endeavors to suppress such rebellion and bring the traitors to justice. Is that turning up the temperature again? You see what's gradually happening. Then, in compliance with those orders, the Royal Navy, under Admiral Samuel Graves, sent Captain Henry Mowat and 6 warships, and they bombarded Falmouth, Massachusetts, which is now Portland, Maine. What we call Maine was still part of Massachusetts until 1820 and statehood. Mowat gave them 2 hours notice to turn over all of their supplies and ammunition. The town refused, and so he sent incendiary shells and then a landing party to burn the rest of the town. 400 plus buildings were burned, 2,500 were left homeless. On the 26th of October, that beautiful ceremony in which the king opens the Houses of Parliament and reads the government manifesto for the coming term, he says, "It's now become the part of wisdom and of clemency to put a speedy end to these disorders by the most decisive exertions." What's that song in Hamilton about, I'm going to get you back if I have to kill you all, kind of a thing, And then, by the way, the Hessians are coming. I'm on good authority that we can get foreign assistance. And remember Queen Charlotte? Remember she was from Strelitz, I don't know, yes. And her brother-in-law is one of the Hessian German princes who sends soldiers to the American War. They're not all technically Hessians, but that's the nickname because Hesse-Kassel was one of the principalities that sent the boys, and they got that nickname. Is this cranking things up? Now we've got foreigners coming into the war. Then Lord Dunmore declares martial law in November of 75. You see what's happening? The waves are hitting the beach pretty hard now. And along the way in his proclamation that he prints up and has distributed, he says, any of you enslaved African Americans who are working for Patriots, these traitorous scum, y'all can come and join us on the British lines and go free. We're not interested in any of you who are enslaved by loyalists. So he's not Abraham Lincoln here, but he is trying to get the workers away from the Patriot farms and businesses. And this is horrifying to many of the others, because any time in the past when African Americans had a chance at freedom, people got killed. Things went badly. It was considered a servile insurrection. So this will be mentioned later on. Meanwhile, what's going on over in London? A VIP was invited to London by the official agent for we would say Native American affairs, they would say for Indian affairs, Guy Johnson. And in the winter of 1775-76, Joseph Brant, whose Mohawk name was Tyen Danagea, I've been told by people I trust that it's spelled TH, but it's meant to be a hard T sound. But I defer to my Native American friends to correct my pronunciation. It's interesting when we know from the newspaper articles and various diaries when Joseph Brant was in London, he did not wear his full Mohawk regalia. He just dressed as an everyday Englishman. We'd say suit and tie, just the basic kit. But he wanted to make a statement, and in the portrait by George Romney, he said, let's do it. And what's that around his neck? It's a gorget showing that he's on the approved list of George III. Sign of rank, sign of, this is one of our guys, kind of a thing. So if you're back in the Continental Congress and there's press coverage that one of the most significant Mohawk leaders is hobnobbing with the British government, what do you think's going on? All right, you think that things are happening. All right, then it gets worse. December 22nd of 1775, the Brits passed the Prohibitory Act, and they're saying, you've set yourselves up in open rebellion and defiance to the just and legal authority of the King of Parliament. You've assembled an armed force, you engaged His Majesty's troops, you've attacked his forts, Ticonderoga, Crown Point, have usurped the powers of government, you've established a Congress, you're establishing these various committees of safety that are growing into state governments, and prohibited all trade and commerce. You're still blocking imports. So because of this, therefore, be it declared and enacted that all manner of trade and commerce is prohibited. We're under lockdown. And any ships and vessels that we catch on the Atlantic or the harbor forts, we're going to grab them. All right, and they'll be raffled off and sold for prize money. So that not only are you not allowed to trade, it's open season on American vessels and their crews, because the mariners and crews are to be taken into His Majesty's service. So they're going to be shanghaied into the Royal Navy. And and by February of 1776, the Congress knows this. January 1st of 1776, Lord Dunmore is off the coast of Virginia in the Chesapeake Bay, and his flotilla opens fire. And there's actually so much of the town is burned that they appoint a Virginia commission to investigate. Yeah, HMS Liverpool, 28-gun frigate with 400 Royal Marines. The people of Norfolk decided the Brits had no right to land to buy supplies or get water. The Brits lost their temper and they blasted the place. The colonial, or the Virginia Commission that investigated it in 1777 found 1,279 of 1,333 structures were burned. That's pretty bad, isn't it? Of course, the commission found out that those were burned after the British bombardment by American forces to keep those buildings from being used by Lord Dunmore. So it makes for good propaganda, but the story's a little bit more complicated. And there we've got a cannonball still in one of the buildings. Now, the guy who tries to nudge public opinion is Thomas Paine. And he came out with his pamphlet, Common Sense. And this rocks and rolls the whole story of public opinion. He was not an American by birth. He'd been born in England. This is sort of a ne'er-do-well fellow. It's hard to make a hero out of Thomas Paine. He's a sequential failure. Sam Adams didn't really have much of a business life either. He had troubles too. But in 1774, he went to Pennsylvania because he'd met Ben Franklin, one of our colonial agents, representatives to the British government. He put out this 47-page pamphlet, Common Sense. Later on, he'll do another series called The American Crisis, which is very important, and George Washington had The American Crisis read to his troops before the Trenton campaign. So he's a very important guy. 1787, he went back to England, and he wrote The Rights of Man, defending the ideals of the French Revolution. He's an internationalist. Tomorrow I have to give a talk to the Sons of the next Saturday I talk to the Sons of the American Revolution. And the topic they gave me was Thomas Paine, Patriot. Well, he's on the Patriot, capital P side, but he's not a small p patriot because he's an internationalist. Can you catch the difference between those two? A patriot cares about his or her personal country. That's patriotism. He's an internationalist. He's going to be hanging with the French Revolution right up to the point where they almost guillotined him. 1802, he came back to America. Well, what was in the Common Sense that was so important? It's a direct attack on George III. The other Dickinson and the others were all very much tiptoeing around and didn't want to really insult the royal prerogatives and the king. He does. He takes monarchy on. He's not a religious man, but he knows New England. All the rest of the Americans have gone through the Great Awakening. If you can make a biblical argument, make it. 1 Samuel 8:10. Look it up. It's against kingship when the chosen people say, "Oh, we want to have a king," and the prophet Samuel says, "No, don't do that." He makes logical arguments against hereditary rule. The plain truth is that the antiquity of the English monarchy will not bear looking into. He calls them a bunch of banditti from the Norman Conquest on. And he says if you have hereditary rule, it opens the door to the foolish, the wicked, and the improper. Who's to say that your son or daughter is going to be as smart as you are? All right? Royals are frequently the most ignorant and unfit due to their isolated upbringing. Whenever a child inherits, you have regency. When they're elderly and senile, you have a regency. Is that a wobbly way to run a government? Yeah, we're going to find out about that later on when George III goes bonkers. And should we have a regency? Shouldn't we have a regency? By the way, we're fighting the Napoleonic Wars. Yeah, we better have a regency. And what's interesting, I love this line. They say hereditary rule preserves from civil wars. History says no. There have been, and he counts 8 civil wars and 19 rebellions. Is that a pretty logical, accessible series of arguments? And then he takes on reconciliation. After the Olive Branch petition, John Dickinson is still trying to find a way that we can sort this all out. And he's not the only one. James Wilson, there's some very key thinkers. And Paine says, no. It doesn't, being with part of Britain doesn't help us. It keeps dragging us into these dynastic wars, especially because the King of Britain is also the Elector of Hanover, later the King of Hanover. And that's a dangerous piece of real estate that everybody keeps walking through. Every quiet method of peace has been ineffectual. We've tried reconciliation, and they rejected the olive branch, It's not in the power to do this continent justice, waiting 4 to 5 months for an answer. We forget they didn't have cell phone service. If the legislature, the House of Burgesses, has a question to go to UK, it could be a month to get over to UK, 2 months for the answer to come back. It's a harder voyage. We know because of the Gulf Stream. And what's to say that the Brits are going to act on that request or problem immediately? There are times when the colonial legislatures, 2 years before they got an answer to some problem. So I love this. There's something absurd in supposing a continent to be perpetually governed by an island. And he said, look, we fought them on April 19th, 75. If we reconcile, the king still has power. Hint, hint. Are they going to hunt down the people who had already done violence the way Charles II hunted down all the people who did Cromwell's will and executed the king? It's unreasonable to expect foreign help if we're fighting for reconciliation. The French, the Spanish, the Dutch will help us if we're actually breaking with the Brits. They're not going to help us just fight for reconciliation. And therefore, we have it in our power to begin the world again, the beginnings of this utopian, by golly, we really are changing the world. You can see where those arguments could push us along. John Adams, Suzanne's favorite person, we've got him coming in. And so on May 15th, 1776, he comes up with really the first decisive step toward publicly coming out for independence. This is a portrait by John Singleton Copley in 1783 in London when he meets George III. And as they sing, as the king sings in Hamilton, I know that guy. I've met that guy. They're going to eat him alive. But what had happened was, by the time we get to May 15th of 1776, he says, look, we've lost, the Brits are no longer running the government. Their governors, if they're around, are floating around on warships off the coast. And therefore, Congress passes a resolution saying that it's necessary that the exercise of every kind of authority under the said crown should be totally suppressed. Nothing that we're doing has any basis in royal authority. Therefore, we have to fill that vacuum by setting up our own provincial government. All right, we're going to do our own government and rock and roll. And all the colonies will respond in their various ways. Now, John is firmly convinced when he writes to the most important person in the world, Abigail Adams. What a brilliant lady. And he writes to her a couple of days later and says, meaning Great Britain, has at last driven America to the last step of complete separation. a total absolute independence. Because if you're telling the 13 colonies to set up a legitimate local government, what are you saying to the British? Oh, you're out of here. De facto, this is the day. John Adams has a funny habit of saying, this is the day they're going to celebrate for hundreds of years. This is the first day that he thinks, oh, this is the day, this is the day. Then he says July the 2nd, and we end up with our fireworks on the 4th. Virginia responds, and they pass their response to the Continental Congress in their resolution, telling their delegates in Philadelphia to vote for that we are to declare the United Colonies free and independent states, absolved from all allegiance to or dependence upon the Crown or Parliament of Great Britain. He's saying, okay, guys, you Virginians, you voted. As long as any new government that we set up allows the internal concerns of each colony to be left to the respective colonial legislatures. The states' rights have a very ancient basis in the pathway of our government. So, Richard Henry Lee is the guy that the Virginia House of Delegates sends to propose the motion. He makes the motion for independence on June 7th, after that resolution of May the 15th. Now, again, we have another one of these guys who'd been educated in England. He'd gone to Wakefield School. He traveled extensively in Europe. He returned in 1752. He had lengthy congressional service, First and Second Continental Congress. 1757, he married Anne Aylett. They had 4 surviving children, and he was in the House of Burgesses from 1758 on. Later on, he also opposed the Constitution, and he was in the Senate once the Constitution went through and the government cranked up, and he was the floor leader for the Bill of Rights. This is Stratford Hall, the traditional home of many of the branches of the Lee family. It was built between the 1730s, it was finished in 1742, and in 1807, someone named Robert E. Lee was born there as well, as Richard Henry Lee and his brother had been as well. You can visit, there's an association that keeps it open. So this is the motion that he makes on June the 7th. And this is what is actually the motion that they're going to vote on to bring about our independence. That's if they get the votes. Resolved that we are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown and all political connections is and ought to be totally dissolved. Now, the interesting thing is they're not just thinking of independence. They said, and we want to get foreign alliances, and we need to get a proper government of our confederation. So they've got committees going to work on all 3 of those different things. We fixate on the committee that was writing the Declaration of Independence. John Dickinson is up to his neck in the Confederation plans, and others are involved in the foreign alliances. So June the 8th, they decided, well, let's give everybody a chance to consult with their legislatures back home, and we'll vote on Richard Henry Lee's Virginia resolution on July the 1st. On June 11th, they say, hey, in case that passes, let's get a committee to write the declaration for what are the rules for the alliances, what is the outline of government going to be, oh, and what are the principles of our Declaration of Independence. So they get a head start. They get a head start, and then they receive, while they're working on it, the Virginia Declaration of Rights by guess who? George Mason. And that all men are by nature equally free and independent and have certain inherent rights, namely the enjoyment of life and liberty. That sounds vaguely reminiscent of some other language that we know. So again, and we know that Thomas Jefferson has seen this because we know that he had this document. It had been printed in the Philadelphia papers, believe it or not. All right? So on June the 28th, the committee that was was tasked with creating the draft of the Declaration, brings it in and gives it to the Continental Congress. The famous painting that we see that some people think is the signing of the Declaration is really what's happening on June 28th. At the table are these 5 men. You want to guess? That's Ben Franklin. There's Thomas Jefferson, the world's most dangerous redhead. Got John Adams. And who are the other guys? Robert Livingston of New York and Roger Sherman. So we end up with, they present it. Now, are they ready to vote on that? No, they haven't voted on Richard Henry Lee's motion yet. So it's immediately tabled so that it's ready to be brought up for a vote if and when it's needed. Now, the problem is we've got some of the colonies that are not on board yet. Some have gotten absolutely prohibited from voting for independence, like New York. They could only vote for reconciliation matters. South Carolina passed permissive instructions saying, we like the idea of independence, so you, our South Carolina delegates, can vote for independence if and when you see fit. Whoa. All right. The South Carolina delegation is not convinced, and so the youngest one of the delegates, John Rutledge, has to stand up on the first and say, can you please give us another day so that I can talk again to my South Carolina delegates? And that, in fact, is what happens. I typed this out wrong. That's Edward Rutledge. I'm so sorry, everyone. John Rutledge is his older brother. So make believe that's Edward Rutledge. He had married Henrietta Middleton, a famous South Carolina family. They have 3 children. And later on, in 1776, he'll get sent on a peace mission to Staten Island with John Adams and Ben Franklin to meet with Admiral Lord Howe. This guy became a POW after the fall of Charleston in 1780, and he's held at the fortress at St. Augustine, Florida, until July of 1781. He died in 1800 as the governor of South Carolina. Forgive me, Edward, I really messed up on that. But he manages to convince the South Carolina delegates. Delaware is tied 1-1, and famously Caesar Rodney got the message, you know, Delegate Rodney, we need you to break that tie. And he rode something like 70 miles to vote and make it 2-1 for independence for Delaware. He had already been diagnosed with a cancer that was visible on his face, and he died eventually of those complications. The Delaware Assembly had voted for independence, but they couldn't get it through their delegation. This statue recently visited Washington, D.C. It's down on Independence Plaza, down by the National Theater, by James Edward Kelly. The third opposing delegation was Pennsylvania, and they were a big delegation, 7 members, and the votes were 4 against independence and 3 in favor. And 2 men saw which way the winds were blowing and agreed, we won't support independence, but we'll get out of the way. And John Dickinson, remember him? He abstains. The other delegate who abstained is a very interesting man named Robert Morris. He later signed the Declaration in August 2nd, having had a chance to think it on through again. He was born in Liverpool in England. His dad died when he was 16. He inherited the family business. He's the guy who gathers the hard currency for the troops after the Battle of Trenton that allowed George Washington to say, guys, just give me 4 more weeks. and we'll go after the Brits at Princeton, and then you can go home. He actually managed to get something like $10,000 in gold and silver so George Washington could keep that promise. He's frequently called the financier of the Revolution. He's one of two men who signed the Declaration, the Articles of Confederation, and the Constitution. I got up last night and said, who's the other guy? And it's Roger Sherman of Connecticut. So shout out to our YouTube people from Connecticut. In 1769, Morris had married Mary White. They had 7 children. He did business with the Mediterranean and India. So he was the right guy to put on the secret committee to buy gunpowder for the early Continental Army. 1788, he was a U.S. Senator, and he helped Hamilton get through Hamilton's plan of financing, the famous compromise where we get to absorb the debts and you Southerners get a capital city on the Potomac. The song is In the Room Where It Happened. So he's part of that story. But Robert Morris sadly died impoverished. He had given personal guarantees for loans to the government, and he got taken on that. And a land bubble that he was participating in burst. He was in debtor's prison from 1798 to 1801. Not all these guys lived happily ever after. So we've got him in debtor's prison. We've got Edward Rutledge down in prison in Florida. It's a tough life. So here's the sequence. July the 2nd, because of Rodney's ride, because of Edward Rutledge, because of the 2 abstentions, on July 2nd, they vote to approve it. New York had to abstain because they won't get their permission back from the New York legislature until July the 9th. But since they're abstaining, it's considered a unanimous vote. 2 days, they approve the first portion of the motion. Now they take up the rough draft of the Declaration. They argue and edit that for 2 days. July 4th was when they approved the wording of the Declaration of Independence. And that's when they sent it over across the street, and it was printed for distribution to the Army commands and the 13 states in its government. And it's not the way we think the Declaration of Independence eventually looks. It doesn't have the signatures. That happens later on. But this is what is called the Dunlap broadside, and this would have been, you can pass that around, let everybody take a look, would have been passed on to the different commanders. So they approved the wording. July the 8th, they read it from the balcony of what we call Independence Hall, and they sent it out for what was called an engrossed copy. And the engrossed copy, they requested that on July the 19th, and that's on parchment. That's on animal hide kind of a thing. It's a very special, and it was all done up special. And that's the one that's signed that you can see at the National Archives. And the signature was on August 2nd. This is the larger painting. Remember we looked at the committee members before? This is the largest one. Think of how many towns across America people made speeches that said, we're here to remember July 4th when they signed the Declaration of Independence. No, they didn't sign it till August the 2nd. And they didn't print a version of the Declaration of Independence showing the names of all of the signers until a year later. So were they hedging their bets just a little bit? What is it Ben Franklin said, if we don't hang together, we most assuredly will hang separately. What happened? After George Washington had it read to his troops, an angry mob went down to Bowling Green in New York City on July the 9th. They tore down the statue of George III, which they had put up in Thanksgiving for the repeal of the Stamp Act. That statue didn't last very long. And then they busted it up. It was made of gilded lead. And in Connecticut, they made it into 42,000 musket balls. George Washington thought this was very disorderly. So we end up with a dire military situation at the same time. You can look at my YouTube video on the British attacks on Charleston in New York City. George Washington will be thrown, and his army will be thrown out of the New York City area, have to retreat all the way across New Jersey in 1776, until finally the boys fight back at Trenton, New Jersey, and that'll be one of our future talks. The other thing, that New York campaign is led by two brothers, General William Howe and Admiral Richard Howe, running the Navy. It's rare in history you've got two brothers running a campaign. Meanwhile, Benedict Arnold is up on Lake Champlain. He's still a good guy at this time, one of the great heroes of the war, and one of our stories that we'll tell in October, as the Americans retreated in May and June out of the foolish invasion of Canada, the Brits are on their tail, and Benedict Arnold has to slow them down, and miracle of miracles, he does it. So we get the miracle at Valcour Island and the miracle at Trenton, which saved our bacon. So we've got a very interesting story. I hope you gained a few insights into some of the moving parts and the people and documents that made our Declaration of Independence possible. Thank you very much.